Hello and welcome to this short video presentation of some of the basic concepts underlying the negotiations on fisheries subsidies at the WTO. This presentation reviews some of the basic concepts of maritime law and fisheries management that come up in the WTO fisheries subsidies negotiations. It's designed to be a high-level overview of these key concepts, so it's not exhaustive and does not review more technical distinctions or details that might exist in authorities' interpretations and adaptations of each concept. National fisheries authorities and legal departments remain the best source of more detailed advice on how each concept is understood and used in specific contexts. The first set of concepts relates to maritime areas. This is parts of the ocean that are delimited under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and to which different rules apply. Not all WTO members are parties to UNCLOS, but in practice these concepts are commonly understood and generally respected, notwithstanding. The area of the sea closest to the coast is the territorial sea, a band which extends at most 12 nautical miles out to sea from the baseline of the coast. Governments have sovereign rights over these waters, which means the coastal state has full jurisdiction over activities in the territorial sea, with the exception that it must allow the innocent passage of foreign vessels through it. The exclusive economic zone is a much wider band of water, extending up to 200 nautical miles from the baseline of the coast. Under UNCLOS, coastal states have the exclusive right to exploit marine resources within their EEZ, but they also have obligations to manage those resources sustainably. Under Article 61 of UNCLOS, for example, coastal states must maintain or restore populations of harvested species at levels which can produce their maximum sustainable yield. Coastal states may grant other states access to exploit resources within their EEZ within sustainable limits. Now, the concepts of territorial seas and exclusive economic zones come up a lot in the WTO negotiations. A coastal state's ability to regulate the use of marine resources in its EEZ means that that state's authorities have the primary responsibility for taking decisions that trigger many of the subsidy obligations under discussion. For example, determining when IUU fishing has occurred or deciding when a stock is in an overfished condition. These geographical areas are also used in the design of proposed exceptions that would allow developing country members to provide subsidies to small-scale or large-scale fishing within one or other zone. Some proposals in the negotiations suggest, for example, that subsidies should continue to be allowed for small-scale fishing within the territorial sea, on the assumption that this fishing is amongst the simplest and the most essential for coastal livelihoods. Now, these arguments partly reflect some members' views that fishing within their EEZ affects only their resources, but it's important to note that the majority of fishing, in particular in terms of hours, takes place within EEZs, because that generally is where most fish live. Just how much we'll talk about in the next slide. The last area to be aware of is what's called the high seas, or areas beyond national jurisdiction. Essentially, it's everything beyond any coastal state's 200 nautical mile EEZ limit. States can fish freely on the high seas, but they're also obliged under UNCLOS to do so sustainably, and they're obliged to cooperate where necessary. Many states cooperate by establishing or joining regional fisheries management organizations, which we'll explain shortly. So to recap, under UNCLOS, in the territorial sea, a coastal state has more or less full sovereignty. In the exclusive economic zone, it has the exclusive right to exploit marine resources, but also the obligation to use those resources sustainably. On the high seas, all states have the freedom to fish, but they must cooperate to ensure resources are not overexploited. Now, satellite tracking by Global Fishing Watch of large-scale fleets has shown us that the vast majority of fishing activity by those fleets, some 70% of fishing hours, happens within a fleet's domestic EEZ. Another 15% of large-scale fishing happens in another state's EEZ, and the remaining 15% of fishing hours happen on the high seas. And it's estimated generally that by volume, around 33% of global catch comes from fishing of species that live only within EEZs, and another 67% or so comes from species that live in both the EEZ and on the high seas. So to regulate fishing on the high seas, many states have become members of regional fisheries management organizations or arrangements. And there are many different kinds of RFMOs. Some agreements govern only certain species in particular areas, like the 5 RFMOs that are focused on tuna, which are illustrated on this map. Other RFMOs are agreements that cover a wide range of species, but focus on a particular area, like the Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. Governments have also agreed to different kinds of measures under different RFMO treaties. Under some treaties, governments have agreed to establish detailed limits on catch of certain species, but in other treaties, governments have agreed only to share information about catch in the area, for example. RFMOs come up in a couple of different places in the negotiations. The first is in the context of a prohibition on subsidies to IUU, that's illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. And there, members seem to converge on the idea that vessels listed by RFMOs for having engaged in IUU fishing should have their subsidies removed, as long as certain due process conditions are required and are met. In the context of a prohibition on subsidies for the fishing of overfished stocks, members seem to converge on the idea that fish stocks that an RFMO determines are overfished should be considered overfished for the purposes of the subsidy rule. And one of the key remaining questions in each of these discussions is exactly what requirements might be attached to an RFMO's decision, which is made according to its own rules and procedures, in order for it to trigger an obligation to remove some subsidies under this WTO agreement. The next set of concepts relate to the different jurisdictions that governments can exercise over fishing activity. These are sometimes referred to as states' capacities, so we'll use the same term here. Essentially, we're talking about the different legal bases on which a government can exercise some control over fishing activity. The first way a state can exercise control over fishing is if it's a coastal state, i.e. the state within whose EEZ the fishing is taking place. And as we saw earlier, a coastal state has sovereign rights over its marine resources in its EEZ, so it can draw up legislation or regulations to control that fishing. Generally, to fish legally within a coastal state's EEZ, vessels must follow the coastal state's rules. The concept of a coastal state comes up in at least 3 places in the negotiations. And the first is in the discussion of a prohibition of subsidies to IUU fishing. And members appear to converge on the idea that a determination of IUU fishing by a coastal state's authorities should trigger the obligation to remove subsidies from the offending vessel or operator. And a key question remaining is whether that decision should be subject to due process requirements and what those should be. The second place that the coastal state idea comes up is in the discussion of a prohibition of subsidies to fishing of overfished stocks. And there again, members appear to converge on the idea that a decision by a coastal state that a stock is overfished should be accepted for the purposes of the subsidy disciplines. And a key question remaining is whether that coastal state's decision should be subject to certain substantive requirements. For instance, that it be based on the best scientific evidence available, or whether it should reference concepts like maximum sustainable yield. The third place that this coastal state idea comes up is in the negotiations around the prohibition of subsidies to overcapacity and overfishing more generally. Under some proposals there, it's the coastal state that would determine what a sustainable level of fishing is, and it would be for a subsidizing member to ensure it was not subsidizing excess effort or excess capacity with respect to that sustainable level of fishing. Now, the second way that a state can exercise control over fishing is if it is the flag state of a vessel. Under maritime law, every vessel must be registered in and fly the flag of a state. Flag states are responsible in particular for the administrative, social, and technical compliance of vessels flying their flag. International tribunals have also clarified that flag states must exercise due diligence to ensure vessels under their flag comply with any other laws applicable to the vessel's activities, in particular, fishing laws established by a coastal state in whose EEZ the vessel is fishing. Most vessels fly the flag of the state in which their owner is based, but many operators choose to have their vessels fly the flag of other states because of financial or other advantages. Some of these states operate what are called open registries that don't necessarily require a strong link between the operator of the vessel and the country operating the registry. Some states, including those with open registries that register vessels they do not necessarily have any connection with, are sometimes more pejoratively called flags of convenience. Now, the concept of a flag state comes up in another two places in the negotiations. Firstly, in the prohibition of subsidies to IUU fishing, where most, but not all members, support the idea that a determination of IUU fishing by a flag state should trigger the obligation to remove subsidies from the offending vessel. Now, part of the concern here is that some members with open registries fear this provision might somehow be used to infer an obligation to make determinations in their capacity as flag states. Now, this may have already been partly addressed by a footnote that's been proposed to clarify that the ability to make an IUU determination is a right and not an obligation. And this sort of a footnote would actually address a wider concern that the determination provision could be used to infer an obligation to make those determinations itself, which is not the intention. Now, the other place that flag states come up in the negotiations is the debate over rules on subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing. And in that negotiation, some members have proposed that subsidies should be prohibited for vessels or operators that do not fly the flag of the country that subsidizes them. And this is sometimes referred to as the reflagging idea. The third state capacity that's referred to here is that of the port state, essentially the state in whose territory a port is located and where the state has jurisdiction to apply or enforce its legislation, for example, regarding customs duties. Some WTO members are also party to the Port State Measures Agreement, under which they are obliged to deny fishing vessels access to their ports if they have clear reasons to believe a vessel is engaged in IUU fishing. Now, the concept of a port state comes up, perhaps as you would expect, in the context of discussions on the prohibition of subsidies to IUU fishing, where it's been proposed that port state determinations of IUU fishing would also trigger the obligation to stop subsidizing the offending vessel or operator. The last capacity listed on this slide is that of the subsidizing state. Now, this isn't a concept that comes directly from maritime law, but from the fact that we're dealing in the WTO negotiations with building mechanisms for practical obligations around subsidies. Now, a state that provides subsidies has prescriptive jurisdiction to set rules about how its subsidies are used. This concept comes up, like the others, in the context of the prohibition on subsidies to IUU fishing, where it's being proposed that a determination of fishing by a subsidizing state member or a subsidizing member would trigger its own obligation to remove subsidies from that vessel. Now, this might sound a bit circular, but it could be useful in at least one important way. It could encourage greater coherence between members' fisheries policies and their subsidy policies. Not all governments require that subsidies be withdrawn from operators engaged in IUU fishing. And enabling a subsidizing member's determination to trigger a subsidy obligation could encourage members to make exactly that link. So this slide essentially illustrates the way in which different sources of jurisdiction could apply. So, for example, here, a vessel whose operator is incorporated in or subsidized by state or member A can fish in the EEZ of state B using the flag of state C. Now, the next set of concepts relates more to how fisheries are managed. So we're moving from legal concepts to economic and biological ones. Two key concepts that come up a lot in the negotiations and that are in fact present in the original WTO mandate for the negotiations are the concepts of overcapacity of a fishing fleet and of overfishing. The original 2005 mandate, you'll recall, directs negotiators to develop new rules on fisheries subsidies, including a prohibition on certain subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing. Now, there are several different ways to measure fishing capacity. Some focus on the capital stock in the fishery, so the number of vessels and their size. Other methods focus on the total amount of catch that those vessels could catch if they were fully utilised. Whichever way a government chooses to measure capacity, the idea is the same. We're measuring the fleet's ability to fish. Now, fisheries managers will often have an idea of what they think is a sustainable level of fishing. If the fleet is able to catch more than is sustainable, then there is overcapacity. For example, if the limit is 2 tonnes of fish per day, which is what one vessel can catch per day, then that's the overall limit for that fishery. But if there are 3 or even 5 vessels fishing instead of 1, each vessel will probably catch far less than it's technically able to. This is a problem because lower catch per vessel means less profit per vessel and less return on the considerable investment that that fishing vessel can represent. The concept of overfishing is similar, but it refers more directly to the amount of fish caught per day or per season. If the vessels are fishing more than 2 tonnes per day, to use the previous example, then there's overfishing taking place. And if the overfishing continues, the number of fish available could gradually become reduced until the stock is considered to be in an overfished condition. So to put it very generally, overcapacity is the material ability to catch too much fish, and overfishing is using this ability to actually catch too much fish. The second broad concept is that of an overfished stock. Now, in the context of these negotiations, this doesn't mean a stock that is being overfished, not the past participle of overfishing, but a stock that is in an overfished condition, where the size of the resource, the amount of fish in the sea, has been reduced below, often well below, its sustainable level. Often this is because the process of overfishing has happened intensively for a long time. Now, in practice, one problem often leads to another. A fleet that is over capacity will often exert pressure on authorities to increase catch so that all of the vessels in the fleet can catch enough to make a profit. If the authority gives in to that pressure, it can end up setting limits for catch above what's sustainable, and you have overfishing. If that overfishing continues for long enough, you wear down the stock until the total amount of fish is badly reduced. And then you have a stock in an overfished condition. Now, we've referred above to the concept of maximum sustainable yield. It's referenced in UNCLOS as part of the responsibilities of coastal states and is a reference point often used to determine the state of a fish stock. Essentially, MSY is the maximum amount of catch that can be taken from a fish stock on a sustainable basis, year after year. It's the point at which a stock is at its most productive, and having stocks at an MSY level of a particular indicator is a common target for fisheries managers. For example, fisheries managers might decide the level of fishing effort at which a stock can be kept at MSY. So that's F for effort and MSY. Fisheries managers might also choose the level of estimated biomass of its stock at which it can be considered to be at MSY. So that's B for biomass and MSY. It's not the only target that's used though, and we'll discuss the idea of alternative reference points next. But first, the concept of MSY comes up in the negotiations in 2 places. It comes up in the prohibition of subsidies to overfished stocks, where one open question is whether authorities' decisions about stock status taken by coastal states or RFMOs should simply be accepted as they are for the purposes of the subsidy rules, or whether there should be some objective elements of a definition of when a stock is overfished. So proposals for objective elements of a definition refer to a stock being overfished if it's at a level where fishing must be significantly reduced to return the stock to MSY or an alternative reference point. The concept also comes up in the negotiations around prohibitions on subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing. And there, a couple of proposals suggest that subsidies should be prohibited where either capacity or effort in a fishery is too high. And one proposal would encourage members to use MSY as a reference point in deciding if those situations existed for the purposes of the subsidy disciplines. But what about fisheries authorities that don't use MSY as a reference point? Even estimating a stock's MSY can require more data than many authorities have available. So some proposals suggest that the decisions above, so whether overfishing is going on, whether a stock is in an overfished condition, could be made using alternative reference points that an authority might choose. These reference points could be levels of a particular indicator, catch levels, or the size of fish in a typical catch that managers decide indicate whether a stock is being overexploited. So in data poor or multi-species fisheries, for example, it often won't be practical to have MSY calculations for every kind of fish that's caught. And what biologists often suggest in these cases is that authorities could choose a critical indicator species whose health is reflective of the health of the overall ecosystem and monitor those. Now, this is a technical graph which might seem misplaced in a discussion about basic concepts, but we've included it because it illustrates quite neatly many of the concepts we've just been discussing and how they work in practice. This graph is called a Majuro plot, and this one is an actual plot of the status of 4 different tuna species in the Western Central Pacific, produced by the South Pacific community. Now, the horizontal axis measures the size of the stock, and any values in the red zone would mean a stock is considered to be in an overfished condition. So you're measuring biomass, the amount of fish in the sea. These are the situations that the rule on subsidies to overfished stocks would address. In this case, potentially, situations where the biomass of the stock is 20% or less than it would be without any fishing effort. And we discussed the overfished subsidy rule in a lot more detail in another video. Now, one point is that you'll notice here that on this plot, biomass isn't being measured with reference to MSY. It's being measured using an alternative reference point, the biomass amount that there would be if fishing effort was at 0. Now, the vertical axis on this graph measures fishing effort, specifically where the fishing effort is above that required to keep the stock at MSY. If it is, you'd be in areas A or B. If fishing effort is below that required to keep the stock at MSY, you'd be in areas C or D. And generally, in this case, you'd want to be in area D, where the stock is not overfished and where overfishing is not taking place. So a rule that prohibits subsidies where effort is excessive would target situations in areas A or B. And one particular objective of a discipline on subsidies to overfishing is to stop a stock from moving from zone B, where overfishing is happening, into zone A, where overfishing is happening and it's also in an overfished condition. So that's the end of the fisheries science. The next 2 slides talk more specifically about subsidies to fishing and provide what we hope is useful background to some of the proposals on the table, many of which propose different rules for different kinds of subsidies. Now, finding data on fisheries subsidies is not straightforward. WTO notifications, where they are submitted at all, are very patchy. Many list programs, but not the amounts funded, for example. So economists at the University of British Columbia have attempted to estimate what they think is provided per year in nearly all countries around the world. These estimates have the benefit of being comprehensive, but many governments consider the actual figures for them individually are too high. The point to take away from this graph, though, is probably proportionately which subsidies tend to be provided in greater amounts. A larger proportion, it seems, are provided as support to the cost of fuel and as tax exemptions for fishing. Now, these figures also include funds provided for fisheries management expenditure, which is one of the highest amounts the estimates suggest are provided. These estimates also, under the University of British Columbia system, classify different kinds of subsidies into capacity enhancing, that's C, so those that promote fishing potentially beyond sustainable limits. Those that are beneficial, B, so those that help to keep fishing within sustainable limits. And those that are ambiguous, A, which could go either way, have either effect, depending on how they're designed. Now, this slide provides a different perspective in that it focuses on different kinds of support to fishing and the different effects that subsidies can have on fishing effort, fishing capacity, fishers' incomes, and on fish stocks. The graph on the right shows the degree of impact on each of those variables of different kinds of support. If, and here's an important caveat, if there are no effective restrictions on effort or catch in that fishery, i.e. there is open access to the fish. I'm going to highlight just 3 points that are most relevant background for understanding the proposals on the table. First, look at the effort column. Now we see that support to the variable inputs of fishing, that's fishing's operating costs, like the cost of bait or gear, has a very strong impact on the level of fishing effort. Subsidies to fuel in particular have a large impact on fishing effort. Now remember that the concept of overfishing means that too much effort is being applied in a fishery, which means that subsidies to variable inputs or operating costs are arguably the most likely to contribute to overfishing. Second, look at the capacity column. Now this model suggests that funds provided to fishing vessels have a very strong impact on fishing capacity. Support provided to operating costs doesn't have nearly the same impact. Now remember, the concept of overcapacity means that there's too much fishing capacity in a fleet compared to what's required to fish sustainably. So subsidies to the capital costs of fishing vessels, new boats, new engines, new technology, are then those that are most likely to contribute to overcapacity. Now, to underline the important caveat again, this modelling or these particular parts of the model assume there are no effective controls in place or on fishing effort or quantities of catch. Now, this is still the case for the majority of fisheries around the world. Very strictly enforced fishing rules might limit the impact of subsidies on fishing effort and on stocks, at least for a while, but there are very few fisheries around the world where this is practically the case. So the logic about the impact of operating costs on effort and the impact of support to vessels on capacity is the reason why several proposals in the negotiations focus on prohibiting just subsidies to operating and capital costs, essentially because these are the subsidies we think are most likely to contribute to overcapacity and overfishing. But the caveat I described above is also the reason why some proposals suggest that these subsidies might be allowed to continue if effective fisheries management is in place, the key word being effective. The last point on this slide is illustrated in the income column, and it's simply to point out that support provided in the form of variable costs, and in particular support that reduces the price of fuel, tends to provide very little actual support to fishers' incomes. And this is because much of the value of that support can actually end up benefiting the providers of those inputs. For example, the people who sell fishermen bait or fuel, rather than fishers themselves. We hope you found this presentation useful. We've also produced a set of similar narrated presentations on specific aspects of the WTO negotiations, covering scope and definitions, the 3 key pillars of the negotiations, that were subsidies to illegal fishing, subsidies to overfished stocks, and subsidies to overcapacity and overfishing more generally, and some of the key cross-cutting legal and institutional issues. Like this one, they aim to provide simple, succinct summaries of some of the key issues in the negotiation, and they also focus on articulating what we think some of the key decisions are that are facing negotiators, at least as we understand them. If you'd like more information about the analysis we've produced to support the WTO negotiations, please don't hesitate to get in touch. Thank you.